Jake Harrison stood on the bridge of the Earth Defense Station watching something that should have been impossible. The sensors showed over 200 massive ships appearing out of nowhere in Earth's orbit. Each ship was bigger than any building humans had ever made. They just appeared like someone had turned on a light switch in the darkness of space. "Sir, we're getting readings that don't make sense," said Lieutenant Karen Bell from her station. "These ships are using energy sources we can't even identify." Jake had been commander of Earth's orbital defenses for 8 years. He had trained for every possible threat humans could imagine. Asteroid impacts, solar flares, even theoretical attacks from hostile nations. But nobody had prepared for this. The ships looked like nothing humans had ever built. They were smooth and curved, glowing with a soft blue light that seemed to come from inside the metal itself. "All stations, battle alert," Jake said into his communicator. "This is not a drill." Around Earth, every military base went into action. Fighter jets took off from carriers in the Pacific. Missile silos opened across North America and Europe. The International Space Station began broadcasting emergency signals to every nation on the planet. But even as they prepared their best weapons, Jake knew they were looking at something far beyond human technology. The alien ships arranged themselves in perfect formation around Earth. They moved without any visible engines or thrust. They simply glided into position like they were swimming through space instead of flying through it. Jake watched his tactical display as his weapons officer, Commander Lisa Rodriguez, tried to get target locks on the alien vessels. "I can't get a clean reading on any of them," Lisa said. Her voice was steady, but Jake could hear the worry underneath. "It's like they're not really there, but we can see them with our eyes." President Richard Stone's face appeared on Jake's communication screen. Behind the president, Jake could see the chaos of the White House Situation Room. Military advisors were shouting at each other while technicians worked frantically at computer terminals. "Commander Harrison, what's our status?" President Stone asked. "Unknown vessels in Earth orbit, sir. 200 plus contacts. Technology appears to be far beyond anything we've encountered." "Are they hostile?" Before Jake could answer, every screen in the orbital station changed. The alien ships were broadcasting on every frequency humans used. Television sets around the world showed the same image. Radio stations went silent and then carried the same voice. Even cell phones stopped working normally and displayed the alien message. The creature that appeared on screen looked somewhat human but wrong in ways that made people uncomfortable. It had 2 arms and 2 legs, but they were too long. Its skin was pale blue and seemed to shine in the light. Its eyes were larger than human eyes and completely black. When it spoke, the words came out in perfect English but also in Chinese, Spanish, Arabic, and every other language on Earth at the same time. "People of Earth," the creature said. "I am Admiral Zexithara of the Corvani Empire. Your planet has been selected for incorporation into our domain. You have 72 hours to surrender your military forces and submit to Corvani authority. Resistance is not advised." The alien's image changed to show scenes from other planets. Cities that looked like they had been built by different species, all now bearing the same blue glow as the Corvani ships. Some of the buildings were tall and crystal-like. Others were low and spread across vast areas. All of them showed the same thing: alien races going about their daily lives under Corvani rule. "We have incorporated 12 civilizations into our empire," Admiral Zexithara continued. "Each was given the same choice you now face. Those who surrendered immediately were allowed to keep their basic social structures. Those who resisted were pacified through military action. The choice is yours." The broadcast ended and normal communications returned. But Earth was no longer the same place it had been 10 minutes earlier. Jake watched his sensor displays as smaller Corvani ships began moving toward Earth's surface. They weren't attacking, just positioning themselves over major cities. General Frank Miller's voice came through Jake's communicator. "All units, stand down. Do not fire unless fired upon. We need time to assess the situation." Jake understood the order, but it felt wrong. His every instinct told him to fight. But fight with what? Earth's most powerful nuclear weapons were designed to destroy cities and armies made by humans. These aliens had technology that let them appear anywhere they wanted and communicate in every language simultaneously. What could Earth possibly do against that? Dr. Elena Vasquez, Earth's leading expert on theoretical alien life, appeared on Jake's communication screen. She was calling from the United Nations building in New York, where world leaders were gathering for an emergency session. "Commander, I need you to record everything these aliens do," she said. "Every movement, every communication, every action. We need to understand how they think." What good will that do against ships that can appear out of nowhere? Maybe none. But it's the only advantage we might have. They're treating us like every other species they've conquered. That means they think they understand us. If we can figure out how they think, maybe we can surprise them. Jake looked at the tactical display again. The Corvani ships were just sitting there, waiting. They weren't attacking Earth's military forces. They weren't demanding immediate surrender. They were giving humans time to think about it. That seemed almost polite, except for the part where they had just threatened to destroy human civilization. "Dr. Vasquez, these aliens have conquered 12 other species. They have weapons we can't even understand. What makes you think humans can do something those other species couldn't?" Elena was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different, more determined. "Because every species they've conquered so far has done the logical thing. They looked at the odds, calculated their chances, and surrendered to save lives. But humans don't always do the logical thing. Sometimes we do the crazy thing. Sometimes we fight even when we know we can't win." Jake looked out at the alien ships surrounding his planet. In 72 hours, Earth would have to make a choice: surrender and hope the aliens kept their word about letting humans keep their basic way of life, or fight against impossible odds with weapons that probably couldn't even scratch the paint on a Corvani ship. As he watched, Jake realized that Dr. Vasquez was right about one thing. Every logical calculation said Earth should surrender immediately. The smart choice was to give up and hope for the best. But something deep inside Jake's mind was already working on a different kind of calculation. Not the logical kind that looked at odds and probabilities. The human kind that asked a completely different question. If they were going to lose anyway, what was the craziest way they could lose? President Richard Stone stood in the White House war room looking at a plan that every military expert told him was completely insane. The holographic display showed Earth's defensive strategy, if it could even be called that. Instead of gathering their forces at strategic points, they were scattering everything across the planet in the most random way possible. "Sir, with respect, this isn't a military strategy," said General Frank Miller. "This is organized chaos." "That's exactly what it is," President Stone replied, "and that's exactly why it might work." The plan had come from Dr. Elena Vasquez after she spent 40 hours studying every piece of information they had about the Corvani Empire. The aliens had conquered 12 different species, and every single conquest had followed the same pattern. The aliens would appear, make their demands, and then face organized military resistance at predictable locations. Capitals, military, bases, strategic resources. Every species had done the logical thing. The Corvani study their targets, Elena had explained to the Emergency Council. They intercept communications, analyze military doctrine, predict where resistance will come from, then they crush it efficiently. But what if there's nothing to predict? Captain Ben Carter was already implementing the craziest part of the plan. At civilian spaceports around the world, his teams were converting every ship they could find into weapons platforms. Not military weapons. Weird weapons that made no tactical sense. We're mounting industrial mining lasers on luxury yachts. Ben reported to President Stone. We're filling cargo haulers with concrete blocks and turning them into kinetic missiles. We've got a billionaire's private cruise ship that we're converting into a mobile communications hub disguised as a party boat. The logic was simple but insane. The Corvani would expect human military forces to use human military equipment in human military ways. They wouldn't expect a luxury space yacht to attack their flagship while broadcasting wedding music and firing mining equipment at them. Down on Earth's surface, Marine Colonel Amy Brooks was working with an even stranger group. She had been ordered to organize civilian resistance, but instead of training them to fight like soldiers, she was teaching them to fight like humans. Forget everything you know about military tactics, she told a group of volunteers in Denver. The group included farmers, teachers, retirees, and teenagers. None of them looked like warriors, which was exactly the point. The aliens expect us to have command structures, supply lines, strategic objectives. So we're not going to have any of those things. Every group operates independently. Every attack is decided locally. Nobody follows orders from anyone else, because there are no orders to follow. In Texas, a group of ranchers had figured out how to rig their cattle herding drones with explosive charges. In Michigan, auto workers were building armored vehicles out of farm equipment and school buses. In Florida, retirees were converting their golf carts into mobile rocket launchers. None of it made military sense. All of it made perfect human sense. Q. Corvani deadline was 12 hours away when Admiral Zexathara made his first mistake. He sent scouts to Earth's surface to gather intelligence on human military preparations. The scouts landed near what appeared to be a strategic military installation outside Chicago. What they found instead was Lincoln Elementary School. The building had been evacuated days earlier, but the Corvani scouts didn't know that. What they found was a structure full of children's artwork, small furniture, and educational posters about dinosaurs in the solar system. Their analysis computers tried to determine the strategic significance of crayon drawings and playground equipment. While the scouts were puzzling over finger paintings, they were being watched by retired teacher Margaret Phillips and her neighbor Joe Santos, a former Army mechanic. Margaret had been asked to help with Operation Wildcard by doing something that came naturally to her, taking care of kids and their stuff. "Are you sure this will work?" Joe asked, watching the alien scouts through binoculars. "Honey, I've been dealing with beings that don't make logical sense for 30 years, Margaret replied. "I know exactly how to confuse something that's trying to analyze behavior patterns." She pressed a button on a remote control. Throughout the school, every piece of educational equipment activated at once. Computers started playing alphabet songs. Interactive whiteboards lit up with math problems. The school's PA system began, broadcasting a recording of the morning announcements from last Tuesday, complete with reminders about Picture Day and the upcoming bake sale. The Corvani Scouts' equipment went crazy trying to process the information. Their computers registered the sounds and images as some kind of coded military communication. They spent 4 hours trying to decrypt the strategic meaning of Old MacDonald Had a Farm and the weekly lunch menu. By the time they figured out, they were looking at a human learning facility for young offspring. Margaret and Joe had already reported their observations to Colonel Brooks. The aliens were smart, but they were so smart that they couldn't recognize something simple when they saw it. The Corvani invasion began exactly 72 hours after their first arrival. Admiral Zexathara had studied human military history and predicted where Earth's forces would make their stand. His ships moved to attack major military bases, capital cities, and strategic infrastructure. Instead, they found empty buildings and abandoned equipment. Earth's military forces weren't where they were supposed to be. They were scattered across the planet in groups too small to be strategic and too random to be tactical. The first attack came from a Corvani destroyer that had moved to assault the Cheyenne Mountain military complex. The aliens expected to find Earth's command center there. Instead, they found a group of local high school students led by their shop teacher, Mr. Danny Garcia. The students had spent 3 days converting their wood shop into something that barely qualified as a weapons platform. They had industrial sanders modified to throw metal debris, pneumatic nail guns connected to compressed air tanks, and a homecoming float decorated with road flares and cherry bombs. When the Corvani ship came in low to attack the mountain facility, it was met by a barrage of wood screws, metal shavings, and fireworks launched from what appeared to be a parade float. The attacks didn't damage the alien ship, but they confused its sensors enough that it had to retreat and recalibrate its systems. "Did that actually work?" asked student Katie Martinez as they watched the alien ship pull back. "I have no idea," replied Mr. Garcia. "But they're backing off, so let's do it again." Similar scenes played out across the globe. Corvani forces, expecting organized military resistance instead, encountered attacks that made no sense. A farming community in Iowa attacked an alien ground unit with crop dusters filled with fertilizer and glitter. A group of amateur radio operators in Japan disrupted alien communications by broadcasting television theme songs on the same frequencies the invaders were using. In Australia, a mining crew used their explosives expertise to collapse a section of highway just as a Corvani convoy was passing overhead. The aliens hadn't expected humans to destroy their own infrastructure as a tactical move. Admiral Zexathara watched the reports coming in from his ground forces and felt something he had never experienced in 3 centuries of conquest: confusion. His tactical computers couldn't generate predictions for human behavior because human behavior wasn't following any recognizable patterns. "Sir," reported his intelligence officer, "we're having difficulty categorizing human resistance activities. They appear to be attacking strategic targets with non-strategic assets using non-military personnel in ways that violate standard tactical doctrine." Explain. "For example, a group of human offspring attacked our landing site using recreational vehicles and sporting equipment. Another group used educational facility resources to create what appears to be psychological warfare directed at our analysis systems. We have no classification for these activities." Admiral Zexathara looked at the tactical display showing Earth. Red dots marked locations where his forces had encountered resistance. The dots were everywhere, but they didn't form any pattern. There was no front line, no strategic depth, no logical organization. It was as if the entire human species had decided to fight a war by not fighting a war. For the first time in his career, Admiral Zexathara gave an order he had never given before. "All units withdraw to safe distance. We need to reassess the situation." 3 months after the Corvani invasion began, Admiral Zexathara faced something that had never happened in the history of his empire. He was losing a war against a species that should have surrendered on the first day. His ships controlled Earth's orbit and his forces held strategic positions on the surface, but somehow the humans kept fighting. Dr. Carlos Webb sat in a converted subway tunnel under New York City, surrounded by equipment that looked like it belonged in a mad scientist's laboratory. As Earth's leading expert in behavioral psychology, he had been tasked with figuring out why human resistance was working when logic said it shouldn't. "The problem isn't our weapons or our strategy," Carlos explained to Colonel Amy Brooks during their weekly coordination meeting. "The problem is that we're not actually fighting the same war as the Corvani." The meeting was taking place in what used to be a McDonald's restaurant. The golden arches were still visible, but now the building served as a command center for the local resistance cell. Around the table sat people who 3 months ago had been living completely normal lives. There was Nancy Foster, who had been a crop duster pilot before she started flying attack missions against alien positions. There was Tony Garcia, a car mechanic who now spent his days figuring out how to make Corvani technology break in creative ways. "What do you mean, different? War?" asked Amy. Carlos pointed to a wall covered with photographs and documents. "The Corvani are fighting a military conquest. They're trying to defeat Earth's armed forces and occupy strategic positions. But humans aren't fighting a military defense. We're fighting for something the aliens don't understand." The photographs showed scenes from the resistance that military textbooks would never include. A group of elderly women in Kansas had spent 2 weeks baking cookies laced with industrial solvents, then delivered them to a Corvani outpost with a note that said, "Welcome to Earth." The aliens had spent days analyzing the food for biological weapons while their equipment slowly corroded from the inside. In Seattle, a jazz band had performed a concert outside a Corvani command center every night for a month. The music wasn't loud enough to be considered an attack, but it was strange enough that the aliens couldn't ignore it. Their analysis computers had classified jazz as a form of psychological warfare and assigned 3 specialists to determine the strategic purpose of saxophone solos. "The Corvani are trying to understand us," Carlos continued. "Every action they take is based on their analysis of human behavior patterns. But human behavior doesn't have patterns. We do things because we feel like it, or because it seems right, or because we're angry, or because we're bored." Nancy Foster laughed. "Is that why my attack on the Denver facility worked? Because I was having a bad day and decided to buzz their towers with crop-dusting planes playing country music?" "Exactly. You weren't following any tactical doctrine. You were just being human. and being human is something the Corvani can't plan for. The Resistance had learned that Corvani technology was incredibly advanced but also incredibly rigid. Their ships and weapons were designed to work perfectly under predicted conditions. When conditions became unpredictable, the technology had problems. Tony Garcia had discovered this by accident when he was trying to repair a captured Corvani communication device. The device worked flawlessly until he accidentally spilled coffee on it while listening to a baseball game on the radio. The combination of caffeine, electromagnetic interference from the radio, and the random noise of crowd cheering caused the device to malfunction in ways that Tony still didn't understand. "Their stuff is too smart for its own good," Tony explained. "It's like they built everything to handle every possible situation, except the impossible ones." This discovery had led to what the Resistance called chaos warfare. Instead of trying to match Corvani technology with better human technology, they had started using the most random, illogical, unpredictable methods they could think of. Helen Price, who had been a software engineer before the invasion, had figured out how to disrupt Corvani computer systems by broadcasting random data that wasn't quite random. She would record herself reading poetry while playing video games, then transmit the audio as digital information to alien computer networks. "It's not quite noise and it's not quite data," she explained. "Their systems try to process it as intelligence information, but there's no intelligence there to process. It's just me reading Emily Dickinson while trying to beat level 7 of Tetris." The chaos warfare had led to humanity's first major victory. The Battle of Chicago had started when a Corvani ground force moved to occupy the city center. They expected organized military resistance at key defensive positions. Instead, they encountered what military historians would later call the most disorganized successful defense in human history. The resistance consisted of everyone from the Chicago area who had decided they didn't like aliens. There was no command structure, no tactical coordination, and no strategic plan. A group of construction workers attacked Corvani vehicles with jackhammers and concrete mixers. A high school marching band played fight songs while teenagers threw paint balloons at alien soldiers. The Chicago Cubs mascot, still in costume, led a charge against an alien command post using a baseball bat and pure enthusiasm. The Corvani forces found themselves fighting an enemy that operated by rules they couldn't understand. When the aliens concentrated their forces to attack the strongest resistance, they discovered there was no strongest resistance. When they tried to cut off supply lines, they found that humans were using supply lines that didn't exist. When they attempted psychological warfare, they learned that humans seemed to get more determined when things got worse. "Sir, we're receiving a priority transmission from the High Command," reported the communications officer on Admiral Zexathera's flagship. The message was brief and concerning. Other Corvani fleets across the galaxy were requesting information about human resistance tactics. Word of Earth's unusual defense had spread through the Empire, and military commanders who had never lost a battle were asking for advice on how to fight an enemy that didn't fight logically. Admiral Zexathara realized that the human resistance wasn't just defending Earth, it was becoming an example for other conquered species. If humans could resist the Corvani Empire using nothing but chaos and determination, maybe other species could do the same thing. "Admiral," said his tactical officer, "we're detecting increased resistance activity on Vector Prime and the Jung colonies. The subject populations appear to be adopting human-style irregular warfare patterns." This was the nightmare scenario that no Corvani commander had ever considered. Their empire was built on the principle that superior technology and logical military doctrine would always defeat inferior forces. But humans had proved that logic wasn't the only way to fight. Down on Earth's surface, President Richard Stone was meeting with resistance leaders in what used to be the Lincoln Memorial. The building had been damaged by Corvani weapons, but the statue of Abraham Lincoln was still intact. Someone had put a baseball cap on Lincoln's head and draped an American flag over his shoulders. "How are we doing this?" President Stone asked the group. "How are we fighting the most advanced military force in the galaxy with farm equipment and high school bands?" Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had been studying Corvani behavior since the invasion began, had an answer that was both simple and impossible to explain to anyone who wasn't human. "We're winning because we're not trying to win," she said. Every other species the Corvani conquered was fighting to preserve their civilization. They calculated their odds, made logical decisions, and accepted defeat when defeat was inevitable. But humans aren't fighting to win. We're fighting because fighting is what humans do. She pointed to the damaged memorial around them. Abraham Lincoln didn't fight the Civil War because he knew he would win. He fought it because it was right. The people who built this country didn't rebel against the British Empire because they had a good chance of success. They did it because they wanted to be free. Carlos Webb nodded. The Corvani keep trying to figure out what humans want so they can negotiate or threaten or manipulate us into surrender. But they can't understand that what we want isn't logical. We want to be human. And being human means doing things that don't make sense to anyone except other humans. Outside the memorial, the sound of distant explosions indicated that somewhere in the city, another group of civilians was attacking Corvani positions with improvised weapons and pure stubbornness. The aliens would analyze the attack, try to understand the strategic purpose, and prepare defenses against similar tactics. They would never understand that there was no strategic purpose. There were just humans being human, and that was something no computer in the universe could predict or defeat. Supreme Commander Velkan arrived at Earth with a reputation that spanned 3 centuries and 12 conquered worlds. He had never lost a campaign, never failed to subjugate a species, and never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with superior firepower and tactical brilliance. The Corvani High Command had sent him to Earth with specific instructions: end the human resistance permanently. Velkan's first action was to study every report from Admiral Zexithara's forces. What he read confused him more than any military situation he had ever encountered. The humans were fighting a war that violated every principle of warfare in the Corvani database. They have no central command, reported his intelligence officer, Commander Jexhai. No strategic objectives, no supply lines, no territorial goals. They attack randomly, retreat without reason, and coordinate without communication. That's impossible, Velkan replied. No species can wage effective war without organization. That's what Admiral Zexithara believed, sir. But human resistance has increased by 40% since the invasion began. They're not becoming more organized. They're becoming more chaotic. Velkan decided to approach the human problem scientifically. He brought with him the Empire's most advanced psychological warfare specialists, beings who could analyze and predict the behavior of any intelligent species. If the humans were acting illogically, there had to be underlying patterns that could be identified and exploited. Colonel Danny Brooks was leading a resistance meeting in what used to be a Walmart store in Ohio when the new phase of the Corvani campaign began. The store had been converted into a coordination center, though coordination was probably the wrong word. It was more like a place where humans came to share ideas about creative ways to annoy aliens. We've got reports that the Corvani are changing tactics, Danny announced to the group. They're sending teams to study us instead of just attacking us. Kate Murphy, who had been a detective before becoming an intelligence officer for the Resistance, understood the implications immediately. They're trying to get inside our heads, figure out how we think so they can predict what we'll do next. The group around the table included people whose backgrounds made no military sense. There was Raymond Clark, a high school science teacher, Linda Davis, who ran a bakery, Steve Martinez, a postal worker. None of them had any business fighting an interstellar empire, which was exactly why they were succeeding. "So what do we do if they're trying to understand us?" asked Linda. Raymond Clark smiled. "We help them understand us wrong." This led to Operation Mindbender, which was either the most brilliant psychological warfare campaign in human history or the most elaborate prank ever played on an alien species. The Resistance began deliberately confusing the Corvani analysis teams by doing things that were technically true, but completely misleading. They started by sending the aliens care packages, not weapons or threats, but actual gifts. Food, flowers, handmade crafts, and greeting cards with messages like "Welcome to Earth" and "Hope you're enjoying your stay." The Corvani psychological warfare team spent weeks trying to determine if the gifts were booby traps, coded messages, or some form of advanced psychological manipulation. The gifts weren't any of those things. They were just humans being nice to their enemies because being nice was a human thing to do, and humans did human things even when it didn't make tactical sense. In Detroit, a group of auto workers started a food truck that served alien soldiers. They didn't poison the food or use it to gather intelligence. They just made good sandwiches and sold them to confused Corvani troops, who had never encountered enemies that tried to feed them. The psychological warfare specialist reported to Velcon that human behavior was aggressively friendly in ways that suggest either extreme confidence or complete insanity. Meanwhile, Linda Davis was coordinating a different kind of confusion campaign. Bakeries across the planet started making cakes decorated with messages for the aliens, not threatening messages, just weird ones. Happy Tuesday to our Corvani friends. Thanks for visiting Earth. Hope your families are well. The cakes were delivered to alien positions with no explanation. Corvani analysis teams tried to determine if the cakes contained secret messages, biological weapons, or hidden surveillance devices. They never considered that the cakes were just cakes, made by humans who thought their alien visitors might like some dessert. Dr. Patricia Lewis had been working on what she called weaponized entertainment. The Resistance discovered that Corvani computer systems would analyze any information they received, trying to find strategic significance in human communications. So Patricia started broadcasting Earth's most confusing entertainment to alien receivers. Game shows where contestants answered questions about topics that didn't matter. Reality television programs about people living together in houses for no particular reason. Children's educational programs about sharing and friendship. The Corvani analysis computers became overloaded, trying to find the military significance in programs like Wheel of Fortune and Sesame Street. They classified children's programming as advanced psychological warfare and assigned their best specialist to decode the strategic meaning of Big Bird. Sir, we're detecting increased psychological warfare broadcasts from human sources, reported Commander Jexhai. The content appears to be designed to overload our analysis systems. What kind of content? Educational programming for human offspring, competitive question-answering games, and documentation of human social interaction in controlled environments. Our computers classify it as sophisticated psychological manipulation. Velcon reviewed the analysis reports and realized that his psychological warfare teams were being defeated by television reruns and children's shows. This was not a sentence he had ever expected to think in his 3 centuries of military service. The breakthrough came when Steve Martinez was captured during a raid on a Corvani supply depot. Instead of trying to escape or resist interrogation, Steve decided to help the aliens understand human psychology. He told them exactly what they wanted to know. Humans are motivated by irrational loyalty to inferior beings, Steve explained to his Corvani interrogators. We deliberately choose inefficient solutions to problems. We prefer emotional decision-making over logical analysis. We value abstract concepts over survival. The Corvani psychological warfare teams were delighted. Finally, a human was explaining human weaknesses that could be exploited. They reported to Velcon that human psychology was based on systematic logical failures that can be manipulated through standard psychological warfare techniques. Velcon approved a new campaign designed to exploit human psychological weaknesses. Corvani forces began threatening human families to demoralize resistance fighters. They demonstrated their superior firepower to show humans the futility of resistance. They broadcast messages explaining that human emotional decision-making was inferior to Corvani logical analysis. Every single tactic made human resistance stronger. Threatening human families didn't make humans give up. It made them fight harder to protect the people they loved. Demonstrating superior firepower didn't convince humans to surrender. It convinced them that their cause was important enough that someone was trying very hard to stop them. Broadcasting messages about the superiority of logical thinking just reminded humans why they didn't want to be conquered by a species that thought logic was more important than freedom. Sir, our psychological warfare campaign has resulted in a 60% increase in human resistance activity, Commander Jexhai reported. Our specialists believe we may have misunderstood human psychology. Velcon realized that Steve Martinez had told him the absolute truth about human psychology, and that truth had made his situation worse. Humans really were motivated by loyalty to people who couldn't help them win. They really did choose inefficient solutions when efficient solutions felt wrong. They really did prefer emotional decisions over logical ones. The problem was that these weren't weaknesses. For humans, they were strengths. The final battle of Velkon's campaign began when he decided to demonstrate Corvani's superiority through overwhelming force. He gathered his entire fleet and prepared to destroy several major human cities simultaneously. The demonstration would prove that resistance was futile and force humanity to surrender. Instead, it triggered what humans called the last dance. Every human on Earth seemed to take the threat personally, not as a military challenge to be calculated and analyzed, but as a personal insult that required a personal response. Farmers left their fields to attack alien positions with tractors. Office workers used their lunch breaks to sabotage Corvani equipment. Children organized school projects to build care packages for resistance fighters. Velkon watched his tactical displays as attacks came from every direction at once. Not coordinated attacks that could be predicted and countered, but individual acts of defiance by billions of humans who had each personally decided that they didn't like being threatened. "Sir, we're detecting resistance activity from every population center on the planet," Commander Jexhai reported. "They're not following any tactical pattern. They're just attacking everything we have simultaneously." For the first time in 3 centuries, Supreme Commander Velkon gave an order he had never given before. Supreme Commander Velkon made the decision that would change the course of galactic history while standing on the bridge of his flagship, watching Earth burn with the fires of 1 billion individual acts of rebellion. His tactical computers showed him something that should have been impossible. His forces were losing ground to an enemy that had no military strategy whatsoever. The human uprising that followed his threat to destroy major cities wasn't organized like any military campaign he had ever seen. It was personal. Every human on the planet seemed to have decided independently that they didn't like being told they were going to die, and they were all doing something about it at the same time. Steve Martinez sat in his Corvani detention cell, listening to the sounds of combat outside the facility where he was being held. His interrogators had left hours ago to deal with what they called increased local resistance activity. Through his cell window, Steve could see human civilians attacking the alien compound with garden tools, sporting equipment, and what appeared to be a high school marching band. "You told them exactly what they wanted to know," said the Corvani guard who had been assigned to watch him. The alien's translator made his voice sound confused. "You explained human psychology accurately. Why did this make our situation worse?" Steve looked at his captor with something that might have been pity. "Because you asked the wrong question. You wanted to know how humans think so you could predict what we'd do. But you can't predict what someone will do when they're not trying to win. You can only predict what they'll do when they're trying to be logical." Outside the window, someone had managed to get close enough to the compound's main gate to spray paint "Earth Says Hi" in bright yellow letters across the alien metal. It wasn't tactical, it wasn't strategic. It was just a human being human in the face of superior technology and certain death. Dr. Patricia Lewis had been working around the clock in her underground laboratory, analyzing every piece of Corvani technology the Resistance had captured. What she discovered changed everything about how humans understood their enemy. "They're not evil," she reported to President Richard Stone during what would be their final wartime communication. "They're not cruel or malicious, or even particularly aggressive. They're just completely unable to understand any form of intelligence that doesn't work like theirs." Patricia's analysis showed that Corvani technology was based on perfection and efficiency. Every system was designed to work flawlessly under predicted conditions. Their ships, weapons, and computers were all built by a species that had solved the problem of unpredictability by eliminating it from their civilization. "It's like they've never encountered true chaos before," Patricia continued. "Every species they've conquered has been logical enough to be predictable. But humans don't just use chaos as a tactic. We are chaos. We make decisions based on feelings. We fight for abstract concepts. We do things because they feel right instead of because they make sense. The final phase of the human resistance began when ordinary people across Earth realized that their government and military leaders weren't going to save them. This wasn't a failure of leadership. It was the success of the most human strategy ever devised, letting everyone save themselves in whatever way seemed right to them. Nancy Foster led a squadron of converted civilian aircraft in an attack on the Corvani flagship that violated every principle of aerial combat. Her planes were crop dusters, personal jets, and sightseeing helicopters that had been modified with whatever weapons people could improvise. They flew in no formation, followed no tactical doctrine, and coordinated through a radio network that consisted mainly of people shouting encouragement to each other. The attack shouldn't have worked. Nancy's makeshift air force was attacking the most advanced warship in the Corvani fleet with equipment that barely qualified as military hardware. But Supreme Commander Velkon's defensive systems had been designed to counter logical attacks by organized forces using standard tactics. Nancy's attack was none of those things. It was a swarm of individual pilots who were each making their own decisions about how to annoy aliens. Some dove at the ship's weapons systems. Others tried to ram communication arrays. A few just flew in circles around the flagship playing loud music and making obscene gestures at the viewports. The Corvani defensive computers couldn't generate targeting solutions for enemies that had no flight pattern. The ship's tactical systems became overloaded, trying to predict the next move of pilots who weren't planning their next moves. By the time Velkon's crew adapted to the chaos, Nancy's people had done enough damage to disable several major systems. "Sir, the human attack craft have withdrawn," reported Commander Jexai. "But our defensive grid is operating at 60% capacity. How did primitive aircraft damage our systems?" Velkon realized that the answer to that question was the same answer to every question about human resistance. They had succeeded because they weren't trying to succeed in any way the Corvani could understand. Tony Garcia and Helen Price had been working together in a converted garage in Detroit, trying to understand how Corvani technology really worked. What they discovered was that the aliens had built their entire civilization around avoiding the kind of problems that humans created naturally. Their computers are designed to process information and make predictions, Helen explained to anyone who would listen. But they can't handle information that's designed not to make sense. If you feed them data that's random but not quite random, logical but not quite logical, the systems crash trying to find patterns that aren't there. Tony had figured out how to weaponize this discovery. He had taken apart a Corvani communication device and rebuilt it using human engineering principles. Instead of making it work perfectly, he had made it work good enough while being completely unpredictable. "I hooked up their quantum processor to a car radio and a coffee machine," he explained. "The device still works, but now it also picks up local radio stations and makes espresso. The Corvani computers don't know how to analyze a military communication system that occasionally broadcasts traffic reports and brewing instructions." The breakthrough became the model for human reverse engineering of alien technology. Instead of trying to understand Corvani science, humans just started breaking it in creative ways and using the broken pieces for things they were never designed to do. Dr. Carlos Webb had spent months studying the psychological profiles of captured Corvani soldiers. What he found was a species that had evolved beyond the ability to cope with true unpredictability. They could handle complex problems, analyze vast amounts of data, and make sophisticated strategic decisions. But they couldn't handle the simple, human tendency to do things for no logical reason. "They keep asking us why we fight," Carlos reported. "Not how we fight or what we fight with, but why. They can't understand fighting for abstract concepts like freedom or dignity, or just because we don't like being told what to do." This was the key insight that turned human resistance into human victory. The Corvani weren't trying to defeat human military forces. They were trying to understand human motivation so they could eliminate it. But human motivation wasn't based on logic that could be analyzed and countered. Supreme Commander Velkon's final report to the Corvani High Command was the shortest military assessment in the Empire's history. It contained only 3 sentences that would reshape galactic civilization. Human resistance cannot be defeated through conventional military means. Their behavior is not bound by logical analysis. Do not engage this species again. The Corvani withdrawal from Earth took place over 3 days. It wasn't a retreat in the military sense. It was more like the reaction of a highly intelligent species that had encountered something so fundamentally alien to their understanding that they couldn't process it. President Richard Stone addressed the world from the steps of the rebuilt Capitol building. Behind him, construction crews were repairing damage from months of warfare. Around the world, humans were doing what humans always did after surviving something impossible. They were getting back to the business of being human. They came here, thinking intelligence meant predictability, President Stone said. They thought that any species smart enough to build spaceships and computers would be smart enough to surrender when surrender was logical. They forgot that being human isn't about being smart. It's about being human. And being human means doing things that don't make sense to anyone else in the universe. It means fighting when you can't win, hoping when hope is illogical, and caring about things that can't be measured or quantified or understood by the most advanced computers in the galaxy. 6 months after the Corvani withdrawal, Dr. Elena Vasquez received the first communication from a liberated world in what had been the Corvani Empire. The message was simple. How did you teach them to be afraid of chaos? The answer, Elena realized, was that they hadn't taught the Corvani anything. They had just been human, and being human was something so strange and unpredictable that even the most advanced civilization in the galaxy couldn't figure out how to defeat it. Across the Empire, other species began their own chaotic rebellions. They stopped fighting logical wars against superior technology and started fighting human wars based on stubbornness,